I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm participating in this meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the custodians of the land wherever you may be in the world, or the other participants in the conversation. Today we have Professor Phil Hersher who many of you know from the School of Geosciences. Something a little bit different today because of just for stability. We've got Phil's pre-recorded his presentation, so I'm going to play that for everyone. Something slightly different. So please let me know if there's any technical hitches on that one. But yeah, I'll just get started with that. Alrighty, let's get going.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be back in thinking space after rather a long time away. I can't help feeling that it's a bit ironic as well that I'm able to join you today because of, rather than in spite of, the lockdowns that put us all into this online space. And in fact, that fact is not entirely distant from the topic I'd like to talk about today. So today I'm going to be talking about borders and the pandemic in the Mekong region, looking at the kinds of long-standing inequalities that the pandemic highlights, rather than looking at it through the more established idea of a new normal. So I'll explain what I'm going to do. But before that, originally, Bob kindly invited me to talk about something to do with the pandemic and what's going on here in mainland Southeast Asia, where I'm here in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, around about there. And I didn't really just want to give another talk about the experience of the region. In fact, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre has had some excellent webinars which are available online, both on what's been going on in the region and also what's been going on in Southeast Asian migrant communities in Sydney as they've been isolated from their communities and their families in the region. But even though that's not the main subject of my talk, it is useful very quickly to have a look at the experience of the pandemic in Southeast Asia compared to the rest of the world. Let me start by just having a look at this graph here, which actually comes from a report I'm going to mention in a minute on migrants and COVID-19 that we did for USAID last year to look at how the pandemic has affected migrants. And one of the sort of stark things at that point, this was in November 2020, was that even within the region, the experience of COVID has been quite different. This top graph shows the experience in Thailand, and you can see that Thailand was hit very early on. In fact, Thailand was only the second country in the world to have a case of COVID outside China. The bottom graph shows a situation in Myanmar. And what you can see here is that it was sort of March and April when things really took off in Thailand. And it wasn't until about September that things started to take off in Myanmar. And the importance of this is that many of the nearly 4 million Myanmar migrants in Thailand made a dash for the border as things seemed to be so much worse in Thailand than in Myanmar. Many didn't, most didn't, but a significant number of people moved because of the relativity here. Now, if we look at the bigger situation in mainland Southeast Asia, or the Mekong region as I call it, up until now, these graphs come from just a few days ago, we can see things that look very different. Here's a graph that shows the steady rise. These are new cases per day of COVID-19 at the worldwide level. And you can see that if you look overall in mainland Southeast Asia, it was only very recently that most countries have had their exponential wave of COVID. In fact, even to the extent that this bump you see here in Thailand, which was measured in went up to 100 cases per day, is imperceptible in the graph you see here, because we're working on a scale that's measured by today's standards, which is something like 20,000 cases a day. So you can see that it's really only very recent, but it's also very serious and extreme. So this just gives you an idea of the different experiences between countries, which affects the way in which borders matter as well as migrants start to move home. Okay, so the origins of this talk are in several places. One is this study that we did on the impacts of COVID-19 on migrants in Asia and the Pacific for USAID, looking at what it means for migrant resilience through lenses of health, of governance, of environment, and so on. But it's also come from something I've been involved in out of the National University of Singapore, which is a study on transboundary environmental governance, and for which we recently put in a piece for political geography to look at how COVID has affected transboundary environmental governance. In other words, to look at another dimension of COVID and borders. The immediate context of today's talk is that it's a kind of practice run in a way of a keynote that I'm giving next month at a border studies conference being organized by Mephalong University in Chiang Rai in northern Thailand. It's the annual borders conference, and surprise, surprise, the main theme of the border studies conference this year is the experience of COVID-19. The conference is going to be held in Thai, so I won't give that version of the keynote here today. And it also reflects something that is a much longer standing interest that I have in the process of regionalization and the role of regional institutions in mainland Southeast Asia, which is a very selective nature of regionalization. And this also has resonance with critiques of the elite nature of globalization. In other words, not everything flows equally across borders, a theme to which I'll return. Okay, so as I said, one way to think about the pandemic in terms of what it imposes on us, but also the opportunities it presents to us, is the idea of a new normal. And it was interesting that very, very early on, as it seems now in the pandemic, this term new normal took hold. It really has a couple of main dimensions. One is the idea that we're in a new way of doing things. We need to stand 1.5 or 2 meters apart, depending on where you are. But the other idea of the new normal is that we can do things better. So there is implicitly a recognition that it's an opportunity to maybe take stock, to reflect, and to think about how we can work towards a less unequal world, a more sustainable world, and so on. But also to look at the advantages that we can take from various hybrid practices, like seminars like this. It even gave its name to a guest house and restaurant here in Chiang Mai, the new normal house. As I said, today I want to take a somewhat, although not entirely, alternative perspective, which is not so much to look at the idea of the pandemic as a way of thinking about what's normal and what needs to be changed, but rather as a spotlight onto what needs fixing. The exaggerations, the intensification, the exacerbation of so much that we think of as problematic and wrong that comes from the pandemic may help us to think about what needs fixing, whether we're talking about the very unequal world we live in, the precarity of so many groups in mainland Southeast Asia, in Australia, and everywhere, and also the unsustainable practices. So this was very much a sense that we wrote our report on migrants and COVID-19 in Southeast Asia and the wider Asia-Pacific region, looking at the idea of the pandemic is really not creating inequality or creating unsustainability, but shedding light on things that were pre-existing. And one of the starkest contexts in which to look at this is the context of migrant workers. If we look at migration in the Mekong region, it's very heavily oriented to Thailand. You can see over the last 3 decades, the very rapid increase in numbers of migrants coming from Cambodia, from Laos, and in particular from Myanmar to Thailand. Note that these are only officially registered migrants, and there's at least another third or half, in addition to these figures, of unregistered migrants who are even in more precarious situations. The pandemic, of course, has led to stranding of migrants. As you can see, this gentleman here, for example, living in the very cramped workers' accommodation at a big construction site in Bangkok. This is actually a relatively well-provisioned construction site in terms of housing, and yet the spaces involved are tiny. Families typically would live in a space of about 15 square meters for a couple or a family. And when people are stranded, unable to go to work, have to spend their time living rather than just sleeping in such places, it has, as you can imagine, it creates all sorts of hardships. The pandemic has also stigmatized migrants. Early on, like many diseases, the disease was seen as a foreign disease, and as people came from Myanmar and Laos as a concern, they were going to bring it with them. This was very quickly reversed as the migrants themselves tried to escape, in some cases, from the pandemic appearing to take hold in Thailand faster than in other countries. But there's also issues of unequal access to services, healthcare in particular, and so on. But none of this is new. All of these conditions are pre-existing. The pandemic really just sort of highlights this experience for migrants. And of course, migrants are defined as such because of the borders, the other side of which they come from. Here we're talking about international migrants in Thailand and more generally in Southeast Asia. So I'd like to sort of focus the discussion a bit now onto the idea of borders, and also the process that's sometimes be called bordering, the construction of borders. We can see borders at many levels. We tend to look at international borders because of the sort of more absolute way in which they govern movement and vest power in the state, in government authorities to determine what can and can't cross borders. But of course, borders also exist at other levels, which I'll talk about within countries, within cities, within workplaces even. And we also seeing borders as contingent, as being constructed for the pandemic, just to sort of put things in your own space to demonstrate this is what you're living under right now, which is the idea of an invisible 5-kilometer radius that creates a border that determines where you can and where you can't go for the time being. And this is contingent, of course, on time-bound rules. In a very interesting paper published last year in Progress in Human Geography, Michelle Miller, as part of this transboundary project I talked about, talks about the process of bordering. And this is in the context of environment and natural resource management through the idea of the commons, bordering denoting not only the physical, political or geopolitical power of borders to delimit and demarcate access to resources, but also the process of ordering or reordering, of parceling, of fragmenting and enclosing resources, revenues and labor that shape distributive or redistributive inclusions and exclusions. In other words, borders have meaning not just as lines on a map and as places, but also in terms of the substance of what goes on within them and what they allow. Borders have power, they vest power in authority within whatever spaces are bounded by them. So this brings us then along to the key idea that's part of this paper that we've just submitted, and which also is a sort of essential theme in what I'm talking about today. And that is borders are to some extent permeable, to another extent impermeable, but that they're permeable to different things in different ways. In other words, we have what we might call selective permeability. The borders are permeable differentially to different kinds of flows. Typically, labor crossing borders is highly regulated and constrained. Capital, ideas, elite movement may be less so. And we've seen this for a long time. For example, in ASEAN, the so-called ASEAN Economic Community made a big thing in 2015 about allowing free movement of goods, of investment, and to some extent of people. But the extent to which it applied to people was very much an elite phenomenon. It didn't allow the free movement of labor. The pandemic has affected all of these relativities, but it's also highlighted the inequitable and also the unsustainable consequences of such selectivity. Here you see a picture in April 2020 of Myanmar migrants in a rush to try to get to the border to go back home to Myanmar before Thailand closed the border. And many of them didn't make it before they closed the border. Many got stranded at the border. Many others stayed in Thailand, choosing to remain stranded within their tiny living spaces while their factories closed temporarily during the March-April lockdown in Bangkok and other parts of Thailand. So here you can see the consequences of selective border closures that are out of the control of the people who are most affected by them. So if we look at selective permeability in the Mekong region, what kind of dimensions are we talking about here? Well, one is, as I said, the differential between flows of goods on the one hand versus capital and labor. Over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a big increase in cross-border investment with highly socially and environmentally regressive consequences. For example, the so-called land grabs, as companies from Thailand, China, and to some extent Vietnam invest in large-scale plantations in Laos, in Cambodia, and in Myanmar, take people's land. So we can see that this kind of movement of capital is much easier than the movement of people who have to either go through highly regulated migration arrangements or put themselves in even more precarious positions by sneaking across the border and remaining as illegal labor in Thailand in particular. But cross-border investment is not only privileged in this way, it's also during the period of COVID-19 in particular, being privileged by the constrained spaces of contestation. Here's an example of that. This comes from an op-ed that I wrote recently for the Bangkok Post on the case of a large mainstream dam being proposed just upstream of the old royal capital in Laos, of Luang Prabang. And here the issue is that the Thai construction giant, CK Power, which has already built the first large dam on the lower Mekong mainstream at Sayaburi, is now proposing to build this dam. And the spaces for consultation that have been opened up through an albeit imperfect, but nevertheless a new kind of space for consultation with civil society and community organizations, particularly in those communities affected, has disappeared because of the constraints on movement. So the dam and the construction and the flows of investment can go ahead, but those areas for stakeholder input that have been created have now been shut down again. And this reflects a more general concern, which is that if we're talking about regionalism through the Greater Mekong sub-region, through ASEAN, through the Mekong River Commission, as well as through corporate investment, we still see that regionalism is very much an elite privilege, an elite process, while civil society remains bounded within national spaces. To the extent that civil society, NGOs, media, education, collaborative research, looking critically at such processes, has been allowed to develop. It's now been, to all intents and purposes, shut down, at least in a cross-border sense, except for what can be done online. And again, even here, this then creates new relativities as those groups able to work online can do so, but then further marginalizing directly affected communities by such investment. So what we see is new scales of bordering and also new sites of bordering, not just between countries, but also within countries. In Vietnam and in Thailand in particular now, there, because of the outbreak since April, May this year, there have been big restrictions being put on travel. All domestic flights have stopped in Thailand. Most domestic interprovincial bus travel has stopped in Thailand. And this also then means at those sites where there's continuing concern and action and had been protest against, in some cases mine development, in some cases the eviction of Karen and other ethnic minority people from national parks where they've been living for generations. All of this has become much more difficult or has ceased. And at a much more micro level, we also see various disciplining measures being taken at construction camps, at workers' camps, and at factories. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We see also a segregation between migrants and the services available to nationals within Thailand. For example, separate migrant field hospitals with much more rudimentary conditions than Thai nationals would get, but perhaps with better conditions than they would find in their own country. So again, there are sort of different relativities involved here. We also see all sorts of invisible borders not being set up because they've existed for a long time, but becoming much more apparent. And to me, one of the starkest ones is not only the sort of more obvious social class boundaries in terms of who can get access to different kinds of health services and even to different kinds of vaccines, which is a big issue now here in Thailand, but also the way in which foreign nationals are differentiated. So as I said, we've got more than 5 million migrants living here in Thailand from neighboring countries who move here to sell their labor and to send remittances back home. And there's also hundreds of thousands of other foreign nationals, including quite a large Western community, who are treated quite differently and who are privileged compared to the migrants. And of course, I'm lucky enough to be in that group. So we see all sorts of different kind of borders and separations going on here. So moving on, if we look not just the pre-existing inequalities that COVID-19 shines a spotlight on, but also the compounding effects of the pandemic, and especially the emergency provisions that come with it at borders, but also within borders. We can see a number of things. One is the increased surveillance along borders themselves. This is from the Murray River, the border between Thailand and Myanmar. There's been a lot of attempts as things in Myanmar have gone from bad to worse, not only with the pandemic, of course, but also since the coup on the 1st of February this year, and then the combined effects of the coup and the chaos that ensued, meaning that COVID has run rampant, means there's a lot of pressure for many groups to move across the border, so the increased surveillance here. But surveillance happens in other places at other scales. I mentioned earlier on the bubble and seal approach to running factories and construction camps, and spun positively in the Thai media and by the Ministry of Public Health in Thailand in cooperation with the Department of Labor. The idea of bubble and seal is to allow economic activity to continue, and therefore, of course, to allow those migrants who've moved to these factories or construction camps to continue to work and continue to be paid and continue to be able to send some money, if any is left over, back to their families, back home. The idea of the bubble is that there are, as represented down here, is that there are many migrants who live in dormitories that are off-site from where they work. And the idea is that there should be no contact between those migrants and people in the outside community to avoid the risk of cross infection, because the living conditions and the working conditions of migrants are so crowded that as soon as one person gets infected, everyone is infected very, very quickly, in particular with, of course, with Delta. And the other is the idea of seal, which is that the whole living and working environment is all within one bounded space. So you can see these other kinds of borders within these, and they involve all sorts of things. So the idea of the seal is, first of all, to try to arrange for accommodation at the site of work, to control this by a register and very close monitoring of every single migrant, even subdividing, or if you like, bordering them into groups of 5 to 10 who work in the same space and live in the same space to try to ensure that if anyone does get infected, that this is controlled. I guess rather like the sort of bubbles we've seen in a very different context in Sydney, the UK, and elsewhere. And the idea of the seal is to do this, but to then also very closely monitor the movement to and from work, to arrange monitors within the factory management, but also within the worker community. And as I said, there's a plus side to this, which is it allows the factories to keep operating. This is particularly important for the Thai government and the Thai economy, because the tourist industry on which Thailand has become so dependent has almost completely shut down, and therefore the economy is even more dependent on these export-oriented industries within the country. The downside is that the conditions, both the working conditions and the living conditions, are so cramped that it means that people are living in this bounded space in conditions that it would be very difficult to imagine anyone putting up with in Sydney, or indeed among middle class in elsewhere in Thailand. Another example is the bounding of the streets in Bangkok. You may have seen on the news in the last few days the intensification of protests, the use of emergency decrees to in effect create borders within the city. I mean, here's a very extreme example of a border across a main Bangkok thoroughfare to try to prevent access by demonstrators to the Prime Minister's residence, to the Royal Palace, and so on, by putting shipping containers and barbed wire across those streets. But also, this applies not just in Thailand, but much more widely in Southeast Asia, the use of emergency decrees that come under the name of COVID, but that are oriented to trying to keep down social and political unrest. And then there are also time boundaries, if you like, curfews, which limit who can be where, when. Here's an example from last week from the Bangkok Post of the case, in this case, of migrants trying to get back to Myanmar, but doing so out of hours, presumably because these were informal migrants who wanted to cross the border unnoticed. Most of the surveillance of the border is people coming the other way, and curfews have also been applied to deal with street demonstrations and so on. So, in summary, the main messages that I'd like to leave with you are that the pandemic highlights possibilities of a new normal, but just as importantly, it reveals long-standing inequities. Looking at this in a more focused way through the idea of borders provides an important lens onto what the pandemic reveals, but also, of course, what it intensifies. And this intensification helps us see it. And finally, the pandemic instigates borders at the obvious places along national boundaries, but also at different scales, fragmenting and isolating for some, but also consolidating the authoritarian power for others. And here's just a couple of things. Feel free to contact me, but also here's a link to the report and podcast and various blogs associated with this study of COVID-19 and migrants that we did last year. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks a lot, Phil, past Phil. That was very interesting. If you have anything you want to add to that now, Phil, before we go to questions.
No, I'd be quite happy to go straight into questions, discussion, comparative experience, or whatever.
Yeah, excellent. Well, if anyone wants to pitch in on that with anything?
Okay. Oh, well, Jamie, thanks. Thanks, Phil. Sorry I had to miss a little bit of it in between. So I'm not sure how much you did pick up this point. It's possible you did, and I was out at the time. But I'm just thinking it was really insightful, some of the work about bordering. But one of the things about borders is that we have a sense of understanding where the borders are and the temporality of it. And I guess, for want of a better word, the semi-permanence of borders. But one of the things about the pandemic is they're shifting so fast. People could be in the air when the plane flies over, and then they come to a whole different regime, or they might be going out to work or something in the morning, and in the evening they suddenly find that there's new border around their house because somebody else's in the apartment has been infected, and all of a sudden that everything's locked up. So I just wondering if you had any thoughts about that idea, the temporality of borders. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Phil. I think it's an excellent point. And in some ways it kind of further shows the way in which the pandemic intensifies, but it also kind of brings to light things that have existed in the past. So we see this, quite dramatically in the ways that you've just set out. You don't know from one day to the next where the borders are around your living spaces and so on. So that's really we experience that. But at a deeper level, borders have always been contingent to some extent. The rules about what can and can't cross borders, who can and can't cross borders, where borders are, what we think of as borders. They've always been more fluid, I guess, than the ways we sometimes have treated borders in a more sort of fossilized way within political geography. So it's another example, I think, of where the pandemic, for all its horrors and faults, also helps us to maybe recognize things just because they're thrown into such sharp relief. So I think your point's a really, really good one.
Yeah, go for Bill.
Jamie? Oh, sorry, Linda's got a question. I'm not sure who came first.
I'm not sure either.
You go, Bill. You go.
Yeah, mine's a bit of an indulgent question feeding off Phil's, actually, because it's been bubbling around in the back of my mind at the moment. There's something about COVID bringing into focus our conceptions of space. And, for pretty much all my academic career, there's been this sort of shift away from thinking about space in Cartesian terms into relational terms solely. And there's all these globalization metaphors of wormholes and telescopes and things like that. And COVID has brought us shudderingly back to understanding space as a Cartesian, latitude, longitudinal sense that we do. Our lived spaces are defined. Now, of course, ironically, I'm saying this in a Zoom session where we're connecting over a non-Cartesian spatial node. But I know your work, Phil, has been largely driven by funding agencies with sort of some very practical and policy agendas. But to what extent do you think this throws into question many of the ways in which we as geographers have thought about space pretty much over a generation?
No, that's an interesting point. I have to sort of mull it over a bit to give a fuller answer. But I think that, in many ways, it's sort of brought back the significance of being able to divide up the world into sort of geo-referenceable spaces. But at the same time, with technologies that didn't exist previously, and I think it's given sort of power within spaces, the power within those spaces, or as I put it, the authority vested in governments and those in power are now much deeper than perhaps they would have been before. So, on the one hand, we see these sort of Cartesian spaces coming back, and us being sort of fragmented and bounded in ways that we thought we'd moved away from in a more globalized and digitalized world. But at the same time, in a more sort of qualitative sense, I think that there's something different going on here as well. But I think it's a point to sort of dwell on, mull over, and maybe even talk about a bit more. Yeah.
I think Linda was next.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, really interesting, Phil. I was just, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about opportunities is just about potential for more self-contained local economies at sometimes these very small-scale localities at which people are now confined. And I was just wondering if, that was something that you'd observed, that, probably more services, although, of course, supply chains of goods have also been disrupted badly, that there's now more potential for that sort of work in these constrained, bordered localities, particularly in the areas where poorer people are confined. If you see that there's any economic potential for these micro-local spaces that people are living in now.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, absolutely. Not just potential; it's happening right around where I'm sitting right here. We have. I live in a village, as Jeff and Kurt know, called Nong Kwai, which in Thai means buffalo swamp, and we have something called Nong Kwai Marketplace, which is actually online. It's an online marketplace where people locally buy and sell things and just deliver them around the corner. And it's partly been driven by the fact that wet markets, the evening markets, are no longer open, and therefore people have to find new ways to sell their local goods. But we see all sorts of things being popping up. Just down the street from me, we have a new som tam, or spicy salad shop, and fried chicken shop, and so on. All sorts of things happening which weren't there before. So there is a lot more buying and selling locally that's going on now. The extent to which this sort of transcends and continues beyond the pandemic is something that we talk about quite a lot with our neighbours and others. But it's certainly happening. But ironically, in some ways, with new technologies, even though they're being used in a very local way, and as those technologies extend not only to the ordering and so on, but even to the payment. So there are sort of new geographies of commerce and livelihoods going on, and perhaps the sort of most obvious driver of that is that people have lost opportunities to work elsewhere. So it's come both through possibilities, but also just through the need to make a living.
I wonder if people, even if conditions ease with regard to the virus, if there's a continuing sense of vulnerability and uncertainty about when this could happen again, which does seem to be highly likely, whether it could actually be protective to preserve, these sorts of economic relations more locally, because of thinking about at any time there could be the threat. People build up something. Obviously, they've got to build up their new sort of ways of relating economically, and to dismantle it all in the confidence that, they'll be able to go back to more extended relationships. Maybe what people see is not a good idea, too optimistic at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the subtitle of our report for USAID on migrants and COVID-19 in the Asia Pacific was Rethinking Resilience, and this is a in some ways a much more immediate aspect of resilience than the more kind of environmentally oriented idea of resilience. So people are finding sidelines which may not end up being their continuing main income in the future, but may well keep them as sort of backups. And the whole question about the significance of land as something which has become perhaps less important in people's livelihoods as they move away from agriculture, but the idea of a place to move back to in times of difficulty like this, and previously with the financial crisis in 1997, the idea of hanging on to land becomes more important. So it's yet to be seen, but and people's memories aren't always that long. But the intensity of what people are going through now may mean that the ways in which coping happens may, I think, go on, have a more lasting effect now rather than just being sort of temporary solutions.
Thanks.
Very good. Bob, did you have something?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, Phil, it was really interesting. I think that your point about how it highlights some of the pre-existing kind of connections and disconnections is really important, particularly in Southeast Asia. I can really see links with Myanmar and so on. So that's really useful. But it also strikes me that it's a lot of what you're talking about actually exists in Australia as well, and the same patterns are really clear. For example, multiple scales, the borders, like international, obviously, state, urban, rural, and so on. So it's the same pattern exists there. And it's also this selective permeability. Again, migration, moving in and out of borders. Some people, you get people who are students and migrants not having access to financial assistance and so on. So it just seems to me that so many of the things you describe occur in a somewhat different way in Australia. So I think that's it's really an insightful thing. I mean, also all this, even this thing about security and emergency kind of declarations or whatever we call them in different countries, how they can also have a political purpose. Like last year, that sort of the sort of to some extent attempts to close down Black Lives Matter demonstrations maybe they did have a rationale to sort of close that down. But it just seems to me that the whole thing sort of you can just change the names of the countries and probably have fairly similar findings. And that's all just an observation more than anything, but I'm sure you and others have something to say about it.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is I agree. I agree entirely. When I used to run field schools, I'd often tell my students that one of the ideas of a field school is to be able to sort of see things more clearly back home when they get there. When you see things in an unfamiliar environment, sometimes they stand out more clearly than they do in places where you miss them because you live with them every day. So I'd certainly be interested to sort of hear and see what sort of ways this analysis can help look at things in different contexts. Every country, every world region has gone through COVID. But in somewhat different ways, and that partly depends on the timing. As I said, in a very early slide, that's really kind of shaped what's happened here in mainland Southeast Asia, and even more so what's going on now as it's kind of hit us with a vengeance. So there's commonalities, but I think it is useful to think of things also as being sort of context bound and contingent, and just sort of sort out what's common and what's specific to particular places. And this idea of the use of emergency is really interesting. I mean, with the sort of crazy experience you had a few weeks ago of the demonstrations against lockdowns in Sydney, and the way that really sort of polarized people, it was kind of interesting to see that, because the clampdown on demonstrations here has been so much part of an attempt to prevent critique of this authoritarian government using COVID as a pretext. And yet in Sydney, things were framed and understood in a very different kind of way. And the same groups who might be sort of critical of the use of emergency rule in Bangkok may have been quite supportive of the harsh measures taken against demonstrators in Sydney. So again, it's where, where context matters.
That is interesting, thinking about the difference between those two. Does anyone else have any questions at this stage or points to make? No.
I was just going to also, when you talked about how sort of borders emerge, it made me think in Sydney, it's like it's the first time ever people actually became aware of their LGAs. A lot of people go, oh, yeah, I didn't know I was part of Bayside, or I didn't. So for the first time, people ignore their council elections. This actually made them aware of these borders. Yeah.
That is true. I know some people even finding out, not knowing until recently, that an LGA is the same thing as a council, basically. It's it's interesting. Anyway, does anyone else have anything there? If not, we could probably wrap it up. I'm happy to also lead the Zoom call if people want to catch up, as you were saying. I can just stop the recording and leave it open for you all.